Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating topic, and one that's still so relevant for understanding, well, how government works, or maybe how it doesn't.
Yeah.
We've got a stack of material here on Carl Schmitt's The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. It's controversial for sure, but definitely insightful.
It really is. And what's compelling, I think, is we're not just looking at some dusty old text from, early 20th century Germany.
Right.
We're digging into the ideas of Carl Schmitt, a major legal thinker back then, hugely influential, but also deeply controversial later on because of his links to the National Socialists.
Exactly.
And his early critiques, especially of Parliament, they still sparked so much debate. We'll sort of get into why.
So our mission here, for you listening, is to untangle Schmitt's main points about Parliament, democracy, dictatorship. And then look at what his contemporaries were saying, how they pushed back. The idea is to see how these big intellectual battles from Weimar Germany can maybe shed some light on the challenges democracies face, even now. And just to be clear, we're here to explore these ideas from the sources you've shared, lay out the arguments. We're not endorsing anything, just trying to understand the source material.
Precisely. Purely conveying the nuances.
Okay, so Schmitt starts with this fundamental question, right?
Yeah.
Why did people once think Parliament was the ultimum sapientiae, like the ultimate source of wisdom? What was the big idea behind it?
Well, Schmitt argued that the real core of parliamentarism, the idea driving it, came from liberal philosophy. And it boiled down to two things: openness and discussion.
Openness and discussion. Okay.
Yeah. The belief was sort of, if you have this unrestrained clash of opinions out in the open through public debate, then truth will kind of emerge.
Right, like the best idea wins.
Kind of. It was about the victory of right over might. A very high ideal, actually. Trying to turn political fights into reasoned arguments where you persuade people, you don't just force them.
Okay, so that's the ideal. But Schmitt says something went wrong. He points to things like free speech, free press.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bentham was big on that.
Oh, absolutely. A fanatic about the free press.
Right, and division of powers. These were supposed to protect the discussion. But Schmitt looks around in the 1920s, sees mass democracy, and says, nope, public discussion is just an empty formality now. Parliament's outdated.
Exactly. And this is where his critique gets really sharp. He argued Parliament wasn't a place for real discussion anymore. It had turned into a kind of marketplace.
A marketplace?
Yeah, where parties who he saw as just fronts for social or economic power groups, they just show up to calculate their interests and cut deals, probably in back rooms.
Ah, okay. Not out in the open.
Right. He completely mocked the idea that ideas meet in Parliament and give off sparks. He called it a gigantic antechamber, a puppet even.
Wow. So for him, the whole belief in discussion had just collapsed.
Suffered a terrible disillusionment, was his phrase. Pretty strong stuff.
But not everyone agreed, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned Richard Thoma. He pushed back.
He did. Thoma thought Schmitt was being too ideological, maybe? Too focused on the abstract theory and missing the practical side.
How so?
Well, Thoma said, look, Parliament isn't just based on old liberal texts. It's also based on the ideas of the people who actually wrote the Weimar Constitution, like Max Weber and Hugo Preuss.
Okay.
And he argued that real creative discussion hadn't vanished. It just moved, maybe into committees or into party meetings. It was still a form of conference, he said, and that was definitely better than government by violence.
An interesting counterpoint. So that brings us to Weimar itself. A really difficult birth for that republic.
Wow, incredibly difficult.
Declared a democracy, power from the people. But it wasn't exactly stable, was it? Not like it grew organically or came from some massive popular uprising.
No, not at all. Hugo Preuss, one of the main architects, put it very starkly. He said Germany faced a choice, either Wilson or Lenin.
Western democracy or Russian communism?
Exactly. Western democracy or brutal Russian fanaticism, as he called it. He wanted a unified Germany based on free self-determination. Now, Max Weber, another key figure, he was initially quite wary of giving too much power directly to the masses, worried about Caesaristic power.
Like a dictator rising up through popular appeal.
Kind of, yeah. But later, Weber actually argued for a plebiscitary Reichspräsident, a president elected directly by the people.
Interesting shifts. Why?
He thought this figure could appeal directly to the nation, especially in a crisis, providing stability, but still balanced by Parliament. This thinking also fed into Article 48, that infamous emergency powers clause.
Article 48. Okay, so Weimar's facing all this pressure. You've got the old monarchists, you've got radical nationalists like Hitler wanting a dictatorship, and the radical left wanting a Soviet-style system.
Real pressure cooker.
And then you have someone like Joseph Schumpeter, a socialist thinker, saying mass democracy actually makes Parliament fundamentally meaningless.
Yeah. Schumpeter's take was that with everyone voting, the real fights weren't happening in Parliament anymore. They were happening out in the economy, in society.
So Parliament was just a sideshow.
Pretty much. Just one front in the class struggle, he said. And he believed irrational factors, emotions, loyalties, that kind of thing were becoming way more important than reasoned arguments.
And Gustav Radbruch, the social democrat, he saw something similar, Parliament as a showplace.
He did. Radbruch pointed out that often the real power wasn't in Parliament itself, but with these extra parliamentary circles, lobbies, interest groups, powerful individuals influencing the parties from outside.
Okay.
Radbruch stressed the need for trust between voters and the people they elected. And he, too, saw the directly elected president as potentially providing some stability in Germany's very fragmented political system. A special place, he called it.
Right. So this brings us to the really provocative part of Schmitt's argument, the part that might make you, our listeners, sit up a bit. His idea is on democracy itself.
Yes. This is probably his most controversial claim.
He says every actual democracy rests on the principle that not only are equals equal, but unequals will not be treated equally, which leads him to argue that democracy needs homogeneity.
Sameness. A shared identity.
And this is the really stark part. If the need arises, it requires the elimination or eradication of heterogeneity.
Yeah.
Getting rid of difference.
Yeah.
He actually cites things like Turkey expelling Greeks or Australia's immigration policies as examples of this democratic principle in action, which is, wow.
It's a very confronting argument. And to understand it, you need to grasp the distinction he's making between democratic equality and liberal equality.
Okay, break that down.
For Schmitt, democratic equality isn't abstract. It has substance. It's based on something concrete people share, like being citizens of the same nation, sharing a culture, or possessing civic virtue. It's about being equal as part of a specific group.
Okay. And liberal equality.
That's the more universal idea, equality of all persons as persons. Everyone's equal just because they're human. Schmitt thought mixing these two ideas, trying to have a democracy of mankind instead of distinct, substantially equal political communities, was confusing and actually undermined political equality.
How so? What was the danger he saw?
He worried that if political equality becomes just this vague, insubstantial thing, if we're all just abstractly equal as humans but don't share a specific political bond, then other differences, especially economic ones, will just rush in and take over politics.
So if we don't define equality politically, economic inequality will dominate.
Exactly. Inequalities would shift into another sphere, he wrote. The economic sphere would rule ruthlessly because the political sphere had become too indifferent, too abstract.
Okay. That's a really challenging idea. And it leads him to another controversial claim. Dictatorship is not antithetical to democracy.
Right. He's not saying dictatorship is democracy, but that it's not necessarily its opposite, especially when Parliament fails. He saw two main types emerging as alternatives.
Rationalist and irrational.
Exactly. The first one, rationalist dictatorship, he saw most clearly in Marxism.
Okay. How is Marxism a rationalist dictatorship in his view?
Because it claims to have scientific socialism and infallible truth about history. It's based on Hegelian dialectics, this idea of a predictable historical process.
Right, the clash of thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Sort of. The point is, Marxists believed they understood the necessary path of history, and those who understood it, the ones with higher consciousness, had the right, even the duty, to enforce what was objectively necessary, even using force.
So the dictatorship of the proletariat wasn't just about power, it was about enforcing a supposed rational truth.
That's how Schmitt saw it. The bourgeois, the class enemy, wasn't someone to be debated with or educated. They were an obstacle to historical progress, to be eliminated. It leads, he argued, to a real and bloody struggle to bring about the classless society.
Okay, that's the rationalist type. What about the second one? Irrationalist theories of direct use of force. You mentioned Georges Sorel.
Yes, Sorel is the key figure here. And his ideas were hugely influential on fascism. Sorel basically threw rational discussion out the window entirely.
Completely rejected it.
Totally.
Yeah.
He was influenced by thinkers like Bergson, who emphasized intuition and instinct over intellect. Sorel championed the power of myth.
Myth at ancient stories.
Not exactly. For Sorel, a myth wasn't a lie. It was a powerful, intuitive image that grips the masses, something that comes from a genuine life instinct. Think of the general strike for workers or intense national enthusiasm.
So it's a motivating vision, not a rational argument.
Precisely. It gives people the courage to use force, to engage in the decisive battle. Sorel absolutely despised parliamentary debate. He saw it as a betrayal of myth and the whole bourgeois ideal of finding peaceful agreement. He called that a monstrosity of cowardly intellectualism.
Strong words again.
Okay.
But didn't Sorel himself distinguish between violence and dictatorship?
He did initially. He hated intellectual systems and bureaucratic control. He contrasted the creative proletarian force of violence, this spontaneous, life-affirming energy, with the cold, military, bureaucratic police machine of a dictatorship.
But then he shifted.
Well, it's fascinating. By 1919, he actually dedicated a work to Lenin. And he even came to admit that nationalism could be an even stronger myth than the class struggle. Yeah, he saw the Bolshevik Revolution, the proletarian use of force, as somehow making Russia Muscovite again, tapping into this national energy. It kind of hints at the blend of nationalism and revolutionary force that we later saw in fascism. Mussolini, after all, explicitly said, the nation is our myth.
That's quite a connection. So bringing this all together, what does this mean for you listening today? Schmitt's critique, agree or disagree, it really forces you to ask some tough questions about democracy, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, about the tensions baked into liberal democracy.
He argued this crisis of parliamentarism wasn't just about Bolshevism or fascism. Even if they disappeared, the crisis would remain. Why? Because of this fundamental clash.
This contradiction, as he put it.
Yeah, between liberal individualism, burdened by moral pathos, is basically individual rights and universal human ideals, and a democratic sentiment governed essentially by political ideals, the collective will, the identity of a specific people.
That clash between liberal individualism and democratic homogeneity, it points to a really deep dilemma. Can a system built on universal individual rights truly handle this need for collective identity, for sameness, that Schmitt thought was essential for real democracy?
And what happens if that belief in discussion, the foundation of parliament, really does fade? What if people look for other, maybe more forceful ways to express the people's will?
These are just historical questions about Weimar Germany. Schmitt was probing the very intellectual foundation, as he saw it, of our own systems, asking what holds them together.
So it leaves us with this thought, perhaps, if Schmitt was right, even partly, that the age of genuine discussion is under threat. And if the best defense for parliament is just that it's, the lesser evil.
Not exactly a ringing endorsement.
Right. Then what actually underpins our faith in these institutions now? What new arguments or maybe a fresh look at old principles do we need to navigate this constant tension between the ideal of democracy and, well, the often messy reality of governing ourselves? Something for you to ponder.